Let's get started. So, good morning everyone and welcome to the Tweeten seminar, which is given this morning by our own Ian Sheldon. Ian does not need an introduction to most of us, but there may be a few here in the audience who do not know him. So let me just say a few words about Ian. Ian has been since 2006 the Anderson's Professor of International Trade. On top of that, he's serving right now as the chair of the Broader Studies Program, the job that he really likes a lot. He has served in the past as the editor of the flagship journal of our association, the American Journal for Econ, also the editor of Applied Economic Perspective and Policy. He's won a lot of awards for teaching, research, and service, both within the department, the college, and the profession as well. Just some of them, he won the AEDE Quality Communication Award, the presidential recognition for service to the AEDE as well. So obviously on top of that, he's a distinguished researcher as well. He'll talk to us this morning about the WTO and how potentially preferential trade agreements between countries may undermine the function of the WTO. So without further ado, we have Ian Sheldon. I don't know how you want to run it. I'm assuming you're happy with taking questions along the way. Then, yeah, the floor is yours.
I'm supposed to wait till the end for that. I'm happy to take questions and clarification. I'd like to try to get through the material as quickly as we can so we can maybe open things up for discussion. Or you can go outside and finish off the bagels afterwards. I'm sorry Luther's not here today. As somebody who's run this seminar in the past, I've organized a lot of previous Tweeten seminars, so it's an honor for me personally to be presenting a talk that Luther and his wife, Lois, endowed probably 20 years ago. If I look at the plaque, he's had 22 years. 92. So it's been around for some time now. Abdul just asked me about the word whither. This is not a part of a horse. This is just me being typically English, trying to use a word that maybe is unfamiliar. So really I'm just asking the question, where are we with the WTO, and in what sense has it either become irrelevant, or in order to remain relevant, what does it have to do to change the way it conducts its business? And by that I don't mean how they negotiate the minutiae of the laws, but sort of more broadly, how does the WTO, does it move away from the fundamental way that economists think it works and has worked successfully, at least under the auspices of the GATT? So where is the WTO at the moment? Well, if you follow these things, and I follow them all the time, this is kind of one of the things I think about a lot. In December, the WTO did actually reach an agreement, surprisingly. So the WTO has been in being since 1994, when the Uruguay round, the last round of successful trade negotiations, was completed under what was then called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. They reached an agreement on what was called trade facilitation. And essentially this was an agreement that pretty much everybody could agree on. You have to remember the WTO is a consensus organization. It sort of believes in this idea of Pareto safety. You don't do anything if you're going to make anybody else worse off. And so you pretty much, it's not about majority rule, it's about consensus rule. And they all agreed on this idea of simplifying customs rules. And if you read The Economist from around about December that time, the OECD had conducted some estimates about the potential economic benefits, and they were substantial. And this agreement, which probably saved the WTO in some sense, was lauded in the media as a breakthrough in the so-called Doha round of trade negotiations. But for those of us who study these things, this agreement has not pushed forward what all previous rounds of trade negotiations have been about, which is about the agenda of tariff cutting. That is what the WTO and its predecessor has done in the post-war period, and if you just want to measure it by how far it's lowered tariffs, it's been very successful. Now, the inability to reach a multilateral agreement on what the WTO is supposed to do raises the question of why has it not been able to do what its predecessor, the GATT, did, I should say. And it hasn't been, the WTO has not managed to do what the GATT did. So what I'm going to do in the talk is focus on three themes that I think you might, if you read the literature, raise in terms of where the WTO is. First of all, I'm going to ask a question, is the WTO subject to what's called a latecomers problem? And by a latecomers problem, this relates specifically to the issue of developing countries. And I'll explain what I mean by a latecomers problem shortly. My view is, yes, there is a latecomers problem, but if the WTO were to work in the way that it's designed to work, this latecomers problem could be resolved. And this is where it's of relevance to us in the room who are agricultural economists. Pretty much the latecomers problem, in my opinion, and the opinion of other economists who think about this, is if we resolve the issue of agricultural subsidies, farm subsidies, we can probably resolve the latecomers problem. At least for some of the countries like Brazil in the WTO who are in some sense holding up the negotiations. I'm not blaming Brazil, they're just one of a group of countries who are involved in potentially holding up. And the US is not innocent here either. I'm then going to ask the question, if you follow WTO issues, if you go all the way back to its predecessor, the GATT, and remember the whole issue about how do we keep Flipper happy, the whole tuna dolphin dispute, the GATT got itself into a lot of hot water with environmental groups over the issue of the US banning imports of tuna from countries that didn't look after Flipper. And so the environment has become an issue that a lot of people outside of the WTO talk about, and a lot of people inside the WTO talk about. Now, I'm not using the word distraction in a pejorative sense here. I'm just going to argue that I think the WTO has moved things along quite a bit in terms of the environment, that the rules are there for dealing with environmental standards. It's just a matter of figuring out how far you think trade policy is a useful instrument for dealing with the environment. My own personal opinion is it's a very blunt instrument, especially when we come to climate policy. And then thirdly, I want to talk about offshoring a little bit. So offshoring is this idea that the production system has become very fragmented. Large firms are now vertically disintegrating, and they're offshoring production, particularly of intermediate inputs. And in what sense is this leading members of the WTO to seek what's called deep integration as opposed to shallow integration? What the WTO or the GATT has done is push shallow integration. The whole focus is on cutting tariffs and market access, and it doesn't go much beyond that, as my discussion about the environment will let you know. And so what this is doing is leading, I want to lay out, at least crudely, what I think the economics is as to why we're seeing this explosion of preferential trading arrangements or preferential trade agreements. Now, I'm using this language here because the language about preferences really matters in the WTO, but if you're not familiar with this idea of PTAs, this is essentially what NAFTA is. The North American Free Trade Agreement is a PTA. The European Union is a PTA. The proposed transatlantic investment and trade partnership between the EU and the US is a preferential trading arrangement. And the reason we use that language is that the WTO has a principle of non-discrimination, which I'm going to talk about briefly later on. There's a let-out clause in the GATT, the WTO, that allows you to form preferential trading arrangements, and I'm going to talk about that. So, what is the function of the WTO? So that's my starting point, to bring everybody in the room up to speed, hopefully, on broadly what we think as economists, the WTO and its predecessor, the GATT, what has it done and why does it do what it does? And it might come as some surprise to you that economists and economic historians have been writing about the GATT ever since it came into being in the 1940s. But it wasn't until very recently, papers in the late 1990s by international economists, that we as economists actually figured out a theory of the WTO and started testing that theory. So a series of papers by Carl Bagwell and Bob Steger, two very well-known international economists, led to pretty much a basic theory that's out there and is being tested quite frequently now in the literature, now that we have pretty good data. And I was telling Abdul, one of the reasons we started doing a lot of testing is we had this interesting experiment where, since the formation of the WTO, we're able to look at countries that weren't members of the WTO and then compare them with them when we then look at what happened to those countries after they had joined the WTO. And a lot of the empirical work that I've got listed here in one of the bullets pretty much is based on looking at samples of countries that joined the WTO post-1994. So, if you've ever done international economics, or if you've done Economics 200, and I'm sure, or some sort of low-level economics class, you spent 10 minutes on the theory of comparative advantage. They showed you a little matrix and they taught you about Ricardo, and then they moved on. Tim, I don't know if you can cover that in your 200 class. And the bottom line from that is that the standard result is if the country is small, the first best, the optimal outcome to that country is free trade. Unilaterally, to get rid of its tariffs and push to free trade. Why? Because the net benefits are positive. The purchasing power increase, along with the benefits to exporters and the benefits of specialization, totally outweigh the costs to those industries that are import competing. And I'm not even going to, this is almost a maximum. There's not many things economists agree on. Pretty much we all agree that free trade is good. And we know how to measure these things. So Krugman, actually, writing back in the early 90s, asked the question then, if free trade is good, and you unilaterally free up trade, why do we need a trade agreement to reciprocally cut tariffs, when it must be blindingly obvious to all countries that we should have free trade? Now, Harry Johnson, who was writing back in the 1950s, and also other economists, international economists writing at the time, Max Corden, for example. The problem with the traditional model is it assumes that countries have no market power, and by that I mean an ability to influence their terms of trade. And by terms of trade I mean the price of a country's imports relative to the price of their exports on international markets. In other words, if we start thinking about relative prices in a general equilibrium setting, if a country is large enough to implement a policy such as a tariff, it can influence its terms of trade to its advantage. Now, Krugman again, and if you go and look at his textbook, Krugman says this is a great theory, but there's no empirical support for it. Does a country like Mexico, it's small, right? You think of it as small, but can it influence its terms of trade? It turns out that there's a lot of empirical evidence, and I just cite one paper here by Broder et al. In the American Economic Review in 2008. There's evidence that countries have monopoly power, and so they can use a tax on imports to drive down the world price of imports, or they can use a tax on exports to drive up the world price of their exportable good and improve their terms of trade. There's clear empirical evidence that countries have this market power. There's evidence that they have exerted this market power, and there's also evidence that when they bargain in the WTO over cutting tariffs, they're concerned about how do we reduce our tariffs in such a way that we don't hurt our terms of trade. So countries, in some sense, do care about their terms of trade. So if you're willing to buy into the argument that countries have market power, and there's empirical evidence to support that, these two results, the theory and the empirics, suggest, and if you add in political economy considerations, because I'm going to say to you that the WTO is not necessarily about free trade. The WTO may be about cutting tariffs, but it may not be about, at least in the short to medium term, about free trade. And there's a very good political economic argument for that. So once you take these considerations into account, modern analysis of the WTO is really just a little game theoretic model. It's about the solution to a terms of trade prisoner's dilemma. So we all understand the prisoner's dilemma. The strategy here is, shall I or shan't I implement policies that influence my terms of trade? If I don't do it, what's the other guy going to do? Right? So the Nash equilibrium, the prisoner's dilemma of a game where countries unilaterally set their tariffs, is to set tariffs in order to improve their terms of trade, impose an externality on the other guy, because you know if you don't impose an externality on them, they sure as heck are going to impose an externality on you. So even if you've only done a modicum of game theory, you should be able to understand the basic argument as to how the WTO, at least by economists, is perceived to have worked, past tense. So I apologize to those of you in the room who don't like seeing economists playing around with equations, but I thought that Luther would appreciate that there had to be some equations at some point in my discussion. And just to show you that there is a theoretical model that underlies the basic arguments that I'm going to present today. So let's suppose, and then you might say to me right up front, Dr. Sheldon, this is a two-country game. In the real world, we have many countries in the WTO. We actually have over 150 countries. The WTO, and this is a subtlety that I never really understood until quite recently, the WTO is not about multilateral bargaining. The WTO is about bilateral bargains that then get extended to every other member of the WTO through the so-called most favored nation status clause, and I'll explain that as we move along. So think about typically who dominated negotiations in the post-war period. It was the Europeans and the US. And now we have other players added to the game, but it's still essentially about a bilateral negotiation between major players in the WTO or the GATT that then gets multilateralized through this thing called the most favored nation clause. So let's assume a home country imports X. So it has a comparative disadvantage in producing X, and it's going to levy a tariff on good X. And you have a foreign country that imports Y, so that Y is the export good of the home country, X is the export good of the foreign country, and the foreign country is also going to levy a tariff. So anything with a star on it is going to be the foreign country, anything without a star is the home country. So there's two sets of prices in here that we have to understand. By the way, I'm not going to show you a full-blown general equilibrium model, and this is a cannibalized version of work by Dixit, Harry Johnson, Wolfgang Meyer, and Bagwell and Steger. So I'm not going to even attempt to present the whole model, but just to kind of give you a flavor. So each country has a domestic price ratio. Okay? So P is the home country's domestic price ratio, and it faces prices domestically of its importable good, PX, and of its exportable good. And you'll notice that this domestic price of X is actually the foreign country's export price with a star on, inclusive of any tariff that gets charged. So this is the domestic distorted price. Remember, there's a simple economic logic here. Tariffs at the border drive up the domestic price. Okay? So the domestic price ratio includes the distortion at the border, and the foreign domestic price ratio also includes a distortion at their border. And we make the following assumption that the home country's price ratio goes up in tariffs. Why? Because the price of X is on the numerator, and in the other country it's a negative because the price of the good that includes the tariff is in the denominator. So you remember, you have to think in terms of ratios here. We also have a world price, and these kind of models assume that you have an undistorted world market in that sense. There's a market clearing price. For those of you who've done international economics, this price comes about through the interaction of the excess demand and excess supply curves for the two goods. So the world price, PW, is just the export price, good X, from the foreign country, and the export price of the good from the home country. We also make assumptions on that. So this basically says that the world price will go down if the home country increases, puts a tariff in place. Why is that? I'll go to this ratio here. When you impose a tariff at the border, you drive up the domestic price, but then there's a bunch of surplus output slushing around on the world market that has to clear up world prices. That drives down the world price. That's where the story, that's the basic story here. That countries have an incentive to drive down the price of their imports with tariffs at the border if they have market power. But of course it also drives up the domestic price, and in a minute I'm going to say a little bit more explicitly about why they might want domestic prices to go up. So this world price goes down, relative prices go down in the domestic tariff, but they go up go the other way with the foreign tariff. Because remember, what's the foreign country doing? They're taxing imports of Y, which drives down the world price of Y, which drives up this relative price. So now let's assume that governments have these things called welfare functions, and I'm not going to debate whether you can derive these things or not. Let's just assume that they exist. And notice I've written welfare on the domestic price and the world price. And I've done this for both countries. And I'm going to assume the following. This thing here says that as the world price goes down because of a tariff at the border, the home country's better off. And it's better off because it benefits, in some sense, from improved terms of trade. Likewise, I've signed it the other way around with a foreign country, because remember, what happens is when they tax their imports of Y, the relative price on the world market goes down, and this relative price goes up, and their welfare goes up. So each country is playing a game where they want to maximize their welfare subject to the tariff choices of the other player, given that an improvement of their terms of trade raises their economic welfare. Now notice too, though, that the domestic price is sitting here in this welfare function. So here's the domestic price ratio, here's the foreign price ratio. So in unilateral policies, what each government does is they pick tariffs to maximize welfare. And they're doing it in a way, if you just think about this, these subscripts are just derivatives. Okay, and then lambda is defined down here. Essentially, what the governments of each country is doing is figuring out how much am I willing to improve my terms of trade, okay, through this parameter here, this variable here. This is the welfare with respect to the world price. Vis-a-vis, how much am I willing to allow the domestic price to increase in order to satisfy domestic political objectives, but at the same time recognizing that if I allow domestic prices to increase, I'm hurting consumers. In other words, there's a loss of consumer surplus. So remember, embedded in here is a political economy model. And that political economy model says that you don't have a benevolent despot who maximizes social welfare. What the government does, or what politicians do, is seek re-election. And by seeking re-election, they seek contributions. And the argument is that import competing industries here will lobby Congress to put taxes or tariffs or have anti-dumping duties in place up to the point where any damage caused to consumers they can continue that trade-off. So the argument here is, yes, they care about domestic consumers up to the point that they might not get re-elected if they allow domestic prices to rise too much. And they don't get any more political return on that. So you can think of those two equations, those first-order conditions, are just tariff reaction functions. Each country is setting its tariff given the tariff choice of the other player, given that they're trading off domestic political objectives against these terms of trade objectives. Now, the Nash equilibrium, if you understand game theory, is inefficient. What's each country doing? Each country is trying to shift some of the costs of their protection onto the other guy. So we want to raise our domestic prices to keep our domestic political support up, but who pays part of the price? It's not just our domestic consumers, it's foreign exporters who face a lower world price. That's the basic story. And each side is doing this. So the thought experiment you want to run here is, let's suppose governments don't care about terms of trade effects. All they care about is setting a tariff to meet domestic political objectives. That's all they care about. So if you just do the math, this becomes the first order condition. In other words, you raise domestic prices up to the point where any domestic benefits politically from raising domestic prices are satisfied. Anything else you do to raise prices is inefficient because you don't need that much protection to get re-elected. Okay? So if you think about it, this is basically getting at the idea is, what if the WTO was a mechanism whereby negotiating governments could simply ignore terms of trade effects because they've been removed from the equation. And by being removed from the equation, let's think about that. Each side has raised tariffs, right? If one side alone were to lower them, there's still a terms of trade effect in there that's negative on the guy who's actually lowered their tariffs. If you both lower tariffs in a balance of concessions, what happens to the world price? It doesn't change. You've lowered the tax on X, you've lowered the tax on Y. If you zero them out, the world price ratio doesn't actually change. So in some sense, you can take it out of the equation. So the argument in the literature is that the WTO pushes for reciprocal cutting of tariffs in a way that leads to both players being better off. It's a resolution to this prison's dilemma. So if you understand diagrams, then it's better than you understand algebra. So here's the tariff of the home country. Here's the tariff of the foreign country. This is a highly stylized way of showing it. This is a symmetric equilibrium that I'm going to show you. These two red lines, those are those two first order conditions. And notice they go through, so this thing here, okay, this is the ISO welfare function, a line of equal welfare for the foreign country. And so which way do you think it's better off? It's better off in this direction where these guys cut their tariffs. Okay, because it's improving their terms of trade if they cut their tariffs. This is the ISO welfare contour of the home country, and of course they're better off in that direction where the foreign country cuts its tariffs and improves their terms of trade. So the nature of the game is that you notice where two of these isopropic contours, if you notice the red line is passing through the maximum point of both of those contours, where the two reaction functions cross is the Nash equilibrium. So notice each country will be setting a relatively high tariff in equilibrium unilaterally. Notice though that a purple line, well, that shows up. This is the world price ratio. If you think about it, if you have a balance of concessions in cutting tariffs, in principle you ought to be able to preserve the world price ratio from where you started, such that if you bargain in this direction, world prices don't change, but you're cutting tariffs. And you're cutting them up to the point where, notice that you have two tangent ISO welfare contours. Both countries are better off bargaining to here. Why? Because you've removed the terms of trade externality. You won't go any further because it's politically optimal to have tariffs here, so this lies on some sort of contract curve. So if you think of the WTO as just a cooperative game, taking you from the Nash equilibrium into the core, where you reach a point where both countries are willing to cut tariffs up to a point where the tariff that still remains is politically efficient or politically optimal. Now, if governments were income maximizing players, there'd be no tariffs in equilibrium. The politically optimal tariff would be where? It would be down here. We'd actually have free trade. But this model is allowing for the possibility that governments don't necessarily maximize national welfare but seek to get re-elected by lobby groups in the economy. This allows for the fact that even with the WTO freeing up tariffs, you could still end up with a positive tariff equilibrium in it. That's why we still have, amongst developed countries, on average 4% manufacturing tariffs in place. Now, you might say to me, well, governments don't talk the language of terms of trade. Well, I would argue that they do. So a tariff does what? It affects import volumes. So if you lower or raise a tariff, what are you doing? If you raise it, you're choking off market access of the competing exporting country. Governments, trade negotiators, firms understand loss of market access. Right? So the argument is that this game is not really about terms of trade. It's about gaining or losing market access for your exporters. And the idea of the WTO, this is where Krugman uses this great language, he calls it sort of sophisticated mercantilism. So the mercantilists said, what? Exports are good, imports are bad. That's still sort of buried in here. But it's getting at the idea, yeah, we'll allow you more market access, more imports, if you give us more market access. Right? So there's kind of a quid pro quo. Some people call it the jiu-jitsu of the GATT. You use the exporting interests who want market access as a balance against the importing interests. That's the sort of political game that's going on here behind the WTO. So the previous rounds of GATT have essentially been about the bilateral exchange of market access by a commitment to lower tariffs. Each side cuts its tariffs, knowing the other guy will cut them. Each gets additional market access. The exporters are better off in each country, and they balance out the import-producing interests who are lobbying for high tariffs.
Ian, question.
Yeah.
Back up to the previous graph. Did I miss it? Did you know what that E star line is all about?
This is the efficiency locus. So remember, I'm appealing to the idea that you will only negotiate in a way that's prey to improving. So if we negotiate tariffs down along the purple line, which is basically a balance of tariff concessions that preserve the world price ratio, yep, each country is moving to a higher indifference curve, or ISO welfare contour. Once you've reached this point, it's Pareto efficient. You wouldn't be willing to lower tariffs any further, because what would happen? I mean, you'd actually be moving to lower ISO welfare contours. So this is just getting at the idea of a cooperative game, is you will continue to cut tariffs up to the point where you can no longer increase welfare. Okay? So yeah, buried in here is the idea of Pareto efficiency. Yeah, Joyce.
I don't think it would affect this equilibrium you're describing, but you haven't talked about tariff revenues here. Is that relevant?
You can put tariff revenue in the functions if you want. That would be part of the income maximizing argument, but it's not necessary. I mean, I could write all the equations where prices are functions of tariffs, and you could figure out tariff revenue.
Does it become an issue then when you think about this extension of bilateral agreements to?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, maybe can we come back to that question? So, let's talk a little bit about the pillars of the WTO. I use this language because people talk about the pillars of the WTO. So the previous rounds of GATT, we had, 8 or 9 rounds in the post-war period, essentially were about bilateral exchange of market access via this commitment to lower tariffs. So this would be, think about the Kennedy round. The Kennedy round was in the 1960s. This was about the US coming to the bargaining table and saying to the then European Economic Community, if you're willing to cut tariffs, we're willing to cut tariffs. Okay, so it's essentially a bilateral game. So then you might say to me, but the WTO is multilateral. The WTO becomes multilateral through this thing called the most favored nation principle. So let's think about that. If you were 2 players, you struck a bargain, you each made concessions, what you'd be worried about is somewhere down the line, the EC would worry that the US would then make a bargain with some other country bilaterally, and you would lose all those concessions. So the idea here is how do we get people to bargain bilaterally, understanding that they're going to generate multilateral outcomes whereby your concessions that you give up in one round are not lost in some subsequent round. Now the US figured this out in the 1930s after the ridiculous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was put in place. They started figuring out how do we get people to the bargaining table, not being worried about concession erosion over time. The idea was to have this thing called the non-discriminatory principle, or the most favored nation clause put in place. So in other words, if the US and the EEC reached an agreement in the Kennedy round, under the rules of the WTO or the GATT, every other member who may not have been a party to the negotiations receives the benefit of those tariff cuts. So supposing Joyce is the EC, I'm the US, right? And I offer you a 20% tariff cut on average, and you offer the same to me, right? And then Abdul is, let's suppose, Japan. Well, you probably weren't a member of the WTO back in the day. I'll make it Japan, right?
Japan is okay.
Joyce has to offer Abdul that 20% cut too, and I have to offer Abdul that same cut as well. So it's now become a multilateral agreement driven by this idea that you and I are both scared that you might negotiate subsequently down the line a 30% tariff cut that I'm not a party to. And so this, in order to prevent concession erosion, we have a multilateral agreement. And the multilateral nature is driven by this thing called the most favored nation principle. And in fact, even under the MFN principle, some countries that aren't even members of the WTO are extended these preferences occasionally. Now, in principle, the WTO, this is a repeated game. We know that repeated games break down. and you have to have some sort of enforcement mechanism. And the argument here is it's self-enforcing in the sense that you can retaliate against somebody else if they unilaterally modify their tariff concessions. So supposing Joyce unilaterally, after we've agreed to cut our tariffs by 20%, decides to unilaterally increase her tariffs. I'll go to a dispute. Erdogan over here he's sitting in Geneva. He's going to set up a dispute panel, and they're going to rule whether I lost market access because you cheated on the agreement. Now, usually what happens is you'll say, "I'm terribly sorry. I will desist from doing this," and we walk away, and the world trading system doesn't break down. But if you're, persistent and will not lower your tariffs back down to what you'd originally done, so I can retaliate. And this is essentially what would have happened in the WTO case against the US in cotton. Brazil won the case. US farm export subsidies were driving down world prices of cotton. US was told to cease and desist. They chose not to. Brazil threatened to slap a bunch of tariffs on unrelated goods imported from the US. At the last minute, the US came along and said, "We'll buy you off," and compensated Brazil. So as long as some sort of compensation, be it you go back to the old tariff negotiation, or you do some other way of compensating, you don't ever actually have to retaliate. And we don't see retaliation that often.
Yeah, just a clarification. So under the most favored nation principles, we got two countries that are bargaining, negotiating lower tariffs between them, and you're saying that extends to everybody else.
Yep.
And then all the other players who were not part of the negotiation, are they bound by that agreement as well?
Yeah.
Do they have to extend?
No, they also have to extend their tariff cuts to everybody else.
So you just need to have a negotiation between two.
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
Dan.
Are there any time frames on the agreement, or is it just like perpetuity? So I mean,
well, each subsequent agreement
so it's scheduled
replaces the previous agreement, and everybody's tariff schedules get changed. Now, you're not asking about how long the agreements take to reach, are you?
No.
Oh, okay. Because some are quick, some are slow.
You might not want that agreement anymore.
Well, you can. There's a potential to renegotiate, but if you renegotiate, you can't do it in a way to infringe the market access that you committed to. That's the whole point. So let me talk a little bit about developing countries in the WTO. So what I wanted to set up was this idea that for 50 years, the WTO has been nothing more, nothing less than reciprocal bargaining over cutting of tariffs and the use of this most favored nation principle. Okay? Nothing more, nothing less. I mean, I know there's a body of law, but it's not about the environment. It's not about development. It's about tariff cutting. It's a very simple idea, and I would argue the WTO is one of the most successful international institutions of the post-war period. It's done its job. Now, thrown into all of this, and this goes back, I think, to your question, developing countries get a free pass to tariff cuts. So, at the very instigation of the GATT, any country that was a member that was had a developing country status got a free pass. And they got a free pass in the sense that, now you're Senegal, right?
Yes.
We cut our tariffs, and we give you those tariff cuts, but you don't have to give us anything in return. That's what the special and differential treatment clause of the GATT allows. And the objective is, we've cut tariffs and we've extended the same benefit to you. That's going to allow you to get market access to the EEC and the US, to both of us. The evidence, the empirical evidence, and this is a great paper, and so I see some of my students in the room. You will know me, I've talked about this paper in the trade class. This is a paper by guys at the bank, Subramanian and Wade. Well, back up. Andy Rose, an economist at Berkeley, in 2004 came out with a rather shocking paper. It said the WTO has had no effect on international trade whatsoever. You could hear a pin drop in the room when he presented that paper. What he failed to do was what he did was just lump everybody in together. What Subramanian and Wade find is that in the post-war period, developed countries who signed up for both the most favored nation clause and reciprocal tariff cutting experienced huge increases in international trade. But developing countries that use the special and differential treatment clause had not increased their trade either at all or very little. Now the big exclusion to this would be China, and remember China's a special case in the sense that China joined the WTO after the WTO was formed in 2001. China has hugely cut its tariffs, and through the MFN clause has had access to 157 other markets. Now China's exports to the US since 1990, does anybody know how much they've increased? Just as a ballpark estimate. And Alan, you can't answer this, but you know it.
I don't know the number, but it's a big one.
1,100%. And the big increase started in 2002 after China joined the WTO. So it's not true that no developing country has benefited from being a member of the WTO. But those countries that joined the GATT in the post-war period typically have not seen a very big expansion in their international trade. And this is puzzling to us as trade economists. Hey, we gave you free access to our markets. What happened? Well, it's a very simple argument. What you get is what you give. So let's think about my little simple example here. Joyce and I, we have bilaterally negotiated down our tariffs, and we've extended that to Abdul over here. Right? Abdul still has his tariffs in place. So those of you who remember your simple general equilibrium model, let's do a little thought experiment. So you've got a country with free trade, two goods, right? And you impose a tariff on the import competing sector. What happens to the domestic price of the import competing sector? It goes up, right? In a general equilibrium model, what does that do to resources in that country that's protecting? It shifts resources out of the export competing sector into the import competing sector. That's why it's inefficient in a general equilibrium sector. So the thing you always have to remember, we always forget this in the trade negotiations. We go, oh, protect our industry, it's being hurt by the nasty damn foreigners, right? But think about the export sector. So a tax on imports is actually a tax on exports at the same time. Reverse that, right? If you get rid of a tariff, what happens? Price in the import competing sector goes down, resources move out of that sector into which one? And remember, what's happening to the world price at the same time as you lower tariffs in this model? The world price is going up, so what happens? Resources all shift into the export competing sector. So Joyce and I have done this, so what's happening? We're getting more competitive at exporting the goods in which we have a comparative advantage, but Abdul can't compete. Why? Because he's kept his tariff in place and kept resources tied up in the import competing sectors in those developing countries that didn't cut their tariffs because they thought they would get access, but the reason they didn't get access was not because there was a barrier at the border, it's because they're still inefficient. That's the basic argument, and Subramanian and Wade's paper provides support for that argument.
Is there some empirical evidence to back that up?
Yeah.
Oh, that's an empirical paper?
Those countries that didn't reciprocally cut their tariffs increased their trade substantially less than those countries that did. Dan?
Just a question. How much of scalability is an issue? Because for a country like China, they have the resources and the manpower to basically participate in the global market, but a smaller country, I mean, it's just restricted in how much it can put out there. And how much
Every country has a comparative advantage in producing something.
Right, but for it to grow significantly.
All the evidence suggests that all
small countries that have
small and large countries that have integrated into the global economy have typically grown. Now, I'm not going to say that trade causes growth or growth causes trade. It's a virtuous circle. But all the empirical evidence that the bank has put out, everybody else, is that those countries in the 1990s that globalized, opened up their borders, right, benefited from international trade, be they small or large. Now, countries in Africa that maybe didn't, a lot of that's due to failed states or lack of infrastructure. That's got nothing to do with trade per se. It's to do with the meta rules about how those countries operate. For sure, failed states don't necessarily trade, but you can factor that out in the econometrics. Dick?
Yeah, you're implicitly arguing that it's political economy problem internally in developed countries. to prevent them from recognizing this error of their ways, so to speak?
I think it's not just the developing countries. It's the whole global consensus would be we should have special and different. I mean, we called the Doha round the development round. But the maxim here, in fact, I don't want to tell a story here that get rid of SDT and everything's going to be okay. There's actually a more serious problem that can I come back to your question? So, even if you got rid of special and differential treatment, right, and it might push back the WTO towards its original purpose, which is reciprocal exchange of market access. Okay? Developing countries may be latecomers. Why might developing countries be late? In other words, a latecomer problem here is where you're a developing country, you're Senegal, you're willing to cut tariffs. I mean, going back to Dick's question, maybe you understand that in order to get something from the trade round, you have to give something. Okay. The problem is, what if we have cut our tariffs so far that we have nothing left to bargain with? So you're late to the tariff cutting game. We've already cut our tariffs. There are no bargains left to be had. So 50 years of reciprocity among developed countries has left tariffs on manufacturers as really, really low, 4% on average. Local price distortions in developed countries have pretty much been eliminated, making it difficult for us, Joyce and myself, to identify new tariff bargains. We in the developed world are suffering from what some people call globalization fatigue. Now, in theory, I love it when economists do this. In theory, you could get around this problem by Joyce and I, we sit down and we say we're going to raise our tariffs that we previously cut in order that we have something to bargain with. You could come to the table with a 30% cut. Right now we've only got a little wiggle room of about 4%. So let's jack up our tariffs to 30% and then let's all agree to cut them by 30. I mean, this is clearly an abstract argument. So the question is there something in the trade negotiations that would substitute for that and would bring some developing countries to the bargaining table? And in some sense get around SDT. Yeah,
I'm sorry, this might be a dumb question. What prevents Senegal from just unilaterally cutting their tariffs? Why do they still need to?
Because of the political economy argument.
So that's just unfeasible.
Let's think about this. You're Sherrod Brown, and it's not Senegal, but it's the only example I can think of in my head. Sherrod Brown comes back to his district, and he's been out in Geneva with the US trade negotiators and said, hey, we decided to unilaterally cut our tariffs by 30%, and his constituents will say, did you get anything in return? And he said, no, well, I believe Krugman, we should have unilateral freeing up of trade. What happens to Sherrod Brown in the next election? He gets canned, right? So that's going back to Dick's argument, is that the political economy is important here. And the idea that you need input, think about the old argument about import substitution, Trebish's argument, that drove the way a lot of developing countries thought for a long, long time until the Mexicos and the Indias and the Chinas freed up their international trade. And of course, look what's happened to their GDP as a result. So I wrote this part of the talk for Luther, and he's not here. So Luther, pay attention. Right? So is a reduction in farm subsidies actually the way to make room at the table for developing countries? You've seen this, right, some of you? So we have here actually I'm going to back up and make a little comment. Initially you'd say to yourself, offering up reductions in farm subsidies for cuts in other countries' tariffs doesn't make any sense. Who's the big winner if the US cuts farm subsidies and everybody else cuts tariffs? This goes back to your revenue argument. Who's the big winner? The US exchequer wins and the foreign exchequer loses, so who's the big winner? And the world price in some sense doesn't change, right? Equal reduction in the subsidy and an equal reduction in the tariff just washes out. The net tariff changes zero. So straight away you might say, not surprising that the WTO is not working, because it's not apparently about reciprocal exchange and market access. Tariff cutting for tariff cutting. So let's set up a little, and I'm not going to talk about everything going on in this diagram. So let's supposing we have the EU and the US here, and this was originally Brazil, but I decided that I'm sure Mauricio was coming, so I just made it DC. So it's a non-explicit developing country, but it's really Brazil. Okay?
You said Brazil.
Oh yeah, right. I thought I'd changed my slides. So you have good X, good Y, good X and Y, and then there's other good Z. So let's treat X as an agricultural good, that the US farm subsidies effectively work like an export subsidy. And so the US is subsidizing its exports onto the world market, and let's suppose the EU would be a typical recipient of exports of that good, but it's directly competing here with Brazil. We'll be honest, it's Brazil. Okay? Could be soybeans, for example. Yeah? At the same time, the US is buying good Y from Brazil and is exporting this other good Z to Brazil. Notice that the EU also exports good Z to Brazil, and there's a bunch of policies in place. So let's suppose that the US wants to get Brazil to the table. The problem is the US right now doesn't have much to offer, right, because it's already lowered its tariffs considerably with the EU, and it's not going to it's not going to raise these tariffs here between themselves, the US and the EU, because that doesn't seem politically feasible within the WTO. So how can we mimic a price increase that would lead the EU to start importing from Brazil, and Brazil would be better off through a change in the export subsidy or the farm subsidy policies here in the US? So let's think about that. What do export subsidies do to the world price of soybeans? If you put up your hand if you did one of my trade classes. Put up your hand. Right up. Eric, you're my student, I'll ask you.
Don't export subsidies drive the world price down?
Correct.
Because they produce...
Yep, the US is large enough that if you use an export subsidy, farm subsidies drive down. That's exactly what the cotton case was about. US farm subsidies in cotton, 25,000 farmers, by the way, approximately. I'm going to be rude about farm policy here. My extension friends up the back. Farm subsidies potentially highly distorting in international markets. So the argument is the US is driving down the world price of soybeans, which of course is beneficial to European consumers. So this is like printing money at the US border and just handing it over to the Europeans, or to keep American farmers happy. You like that one, Alan? You like it? So those of you in terms of policy, go and tell Sherrod Brown we're standing at the border printing money and giving it to the Europeans. Of course, it hurts Brazil's terms of trade. They have a comparative advantage in exporting soybeans. I mean, the US does as well. So let's get rid of this export subsidy. What does it do? It drives up the world price and starts to make Brazil is already more competitive in some sense in many commodities. It now has an incentive to supply even more on world markets. We're pushing some production towards Brazil. But importantly, what would the Europeans have an incentive to do now that their price has gone down? They have an incentive to come to the bargaining table to lower their tariff on imports from Brazil in exchange for what? Cutting Brazilian export taxes on goods Z, which of course, what do they then have to offer to the US? Exactly the same. Likewise down here, if we were to think about good Y might be some good that has not been bargained over much in previous rounds of trade negotiations. Footwear, textiles, products like this have been outside the ambit of the WTO. Think about the multi-fiber agreement. The US and Brazil will already have an incentive to reciprocally cut tariffs if Brazil is willing to change its attitude towards special and differential treatment. So there's two things going on here. Brazil can be brought to the bargaining table in the traditional way in goods which have typically not been covered by the WTO, and so there's still room for the developed country, the US, to cut tariffs. But farm subsidies play this role of raising the world price for Brazil and changing Europe's terms of trade in terms of its imported good coming in here. Now, of course, what throws this a little bit out of whack is the fact that global agricultural markets in the last decade, we've had these price spikes. And what this has led to is not so much export subsidies driving down world prices, but export taxes, export quotas driving up prices. My answer to that is the WTO can deal with that really easily and put in place disciplines on the use of export taxes and export quotas. What I have a hard time with is the US telling India, don't put in place production subsidies, when the US is unwilling to reform its own farm subsidies. In other words, unless you have the political will to reform your own farm subsidy problem here in the US, don't expect the developing countries to do the same thing. So here's my basic argument then. But I have a caveat, and this sort of goes back to your point, Dan. It really affects large countries like Brazil, whose terms of trade are significantly affected by US, European, Japanese farm policy. It may not be as beneficial to a Senegal or those small West African countries that produce cotton. And as I've just suggested, it requires the political will of the US and the EU to reduce farm subsidies. Now, because of all the great questions you've been asking, I'm going to skip a bunch of slides. So it's your fault that I'm running behind time. So I'm going to jump to offshoring and then finish off with my basic point that I wanted to make in the talk. So there's offshoring, which is basically... Yeah.
Is it appropriate, or do you want to maybe come back to this later? Why, you discuss the political economy. Why wouldn't U.S. manufacturers then heavily lobby for, see that they would be the beneficiary of the reduction in farm subsidies? Why don't they?
Well,
or are they all tied up in log rolling? What would be your estimate?
Yeah, then my answer to that would be log rolling, plays a part. But I think it goes back to the idea that there's a failure to understand these interconnected price effects, that removing US farm subsidies actually changes not the position. If we just lowered farm subsidies and we asked Brazil to lower its tariffs, we'd get back to that problem of the big winners, the US and not Brazil. You remember that I have this interconnected effect, is that you've got another country in there that is clearly a net importer of the good which the US is subsidizing in terms of exports. And so bringing Brazil to the table here relates to changing global terms of trade, if you buy into that story. And I'm not sure that the manufacturing sector necessarily sees it that way. But yeah, why wouldn't US manufacturing exporters put pressure on farmers in the US to change their policy choices? And I think that's partly because we're not doing the traditional jiu-jitsu of the WTO of import competing interests being balanced off by export competing interests. Remember, soybeans is an export competing sector, and so it's kind of hard to see that logic there. Now, what we've seen in terms of trade and intermediate inputs is offshoring has led to a huge increase in trade and inputs. In fact, we see a lot more trade and inputs now than we do in homogeneous final goods. So in a world where, let's suppose the home country produces a final good using some customized input that it gets from a foreign country, you have this problem of incomplete contracts in the sense that, and Brian would understand this, that this is a vertical integration problem, right? So you're a large electronics company here in the US, you're offshoring the production of some of your inputs to somewhere in the developing world or wherever it is, and you want that to meet very precise specifications. Those guys overseas have to invest in capital, firm-specific assets, that then the problem then arises when they then supply that input back to the firm here that offshored it. There's potential for breach of contract, right? So these guys try to customize the contract, and then you have these hold-up problems. And the nature of these hold-up problems is that instead of prices being determined on the international markets through the kind of general equilibrium model that I described earlier, they're being derived through ex-post bargaining. So where the input demander and the input supplier are bargaining over rents or surplus. Okay? And the problem with this is with a hold-up problem, you get inefficient supply of inputs. That's a standard Kosian-Williamson type of market failure. So you can't write a complete contract. The WTO certainly isn't going to enforce that contract. I don't see Carl in the room. I remember a year ago a bunch of farmers complaining about, hey, the Chinese reneged on our soybean contracts. Can't the WTO do something about it? And he said, no, it's a private contract, it's your problem. Right? So hold-up problems happen all the time. So the argument would be you should have free trade in the final good, and you should subsidize imports of the input in order to get efficient supply of inputs. The problem in a world of unilateral policy setting is that what the home country does is it's going to target various policies at the input sector. It'll target policies at the final goods sector. And the foreign country, because it doesn't produce the final good, will only target policies at the input sector. The objective of these policies is to extract for your player in the game as much surplus as you can, because all contracts are being determined through ex-post bargaining. So this is a contractual failure problem that leads to firms trying to internalize that problem, and governments help them extract all the surplus. Now, the WTO emphasizes what? You cut your tariffs, and I'll cut my tariffs. All we care about is market access. Okay? That's what the GATT has successfully done for 50 years. But and this is not an original argument by me, this is an argument that's floating around the international economics literature right now, offshoring with a different set of inefficiencies. The inefficiencies are now too little, none of the input being supplied, and potentially distortion of the final goods price in order to try to extract surplus for your firms. Okay? These are new distortions, new inefficiencies that the GATT's not set up to deal with. So in a simple setup, under the GATT rules, what would the home and foreign countries do here? They simply bargain over the policies that relate to market access of the input. Because the foreign country, does it care? It doesn't produce the final good, so it doesn't care about taxing the final good at the border because it has no reason to. All they care about is, can we export the input to the other country that's importing that input, but the country that's importing the input, they produce the final good, and so they care about policies that they can use to target the final good. In other words, they bargain over input policies, but they leave a policy completely free, and it doesn't have to be included in any round of negotiations with the WTO, because the home country is unconstrained in using what we now call behind-the-border policy. So what's a tariff? It's a border policy. Potentially policies that you can target at the final good. They don't have to be taxes or subsidies or whatever. They can be any kind of policy that allows you to use that final good market to extract all the rents from the input market. And they're often called behind-the-border policies. So in other words, once you've got offshoring, where just lowering tariff changing policies at the border on inputs is not going to resolve any final goods market problem. Okay? A trade agreement has to achieve what's called deep integration, and this is the language that's floating around now in trade policy circles. Is the WTO was great for dealing with shallow integration issues, and we've been pretty much successful amongst manufacturing countries at achieving that. What we want to do is go behind the border and go beyond simple market access commitments. So you could reach an agreement that says, hey, yeah, I'm going to allow more input in, and hey, I'm going to stop subsidizing or taxing my exports of the input, but the country that's importing the input still has freedom to play around with final goods policies, behind the border policies they're called. So this would imply the WTO is a rules-based organisation. I described the rules. You have a balance of concessions, and hey, you get it. For the moment, we're allowing you not to respond reciprocally, but I think you should. Right? It's rules-based. That's how it works. It's a legal agreement. There's 20 or 30 or so articles of the GATT that have legal binding, they're legally binding on participants. What we're arguing here is that countries are now seeking individualized agreements that take account of the idiosyncratic needs of the members of that agreement. And the empirical analysis would suggest that there's a strong causal relationship that runs from the growth of offshoring in the 1990s onwards and the big growth in preferential trading arrangements. Now, I'm just going to argue, eyeball that figure there. Just look at the red line. So here we have, here's the formation, this first GATT round over here, and then the formation of the, over here, sorry, this is the EEC. This is the Treaty of Rome. And we transfer along here, here's NAFTA around about here. Yeah, here, 73, that's when Britain went into the EU. Italy was already in. Then Greece and Spain up here somewhere. Okay, and Portugal. And then look at this big explosion of preferential trading or regional trade agreements, bilateral deals essentially, that are outside the ambit of the WTO. So if you look at what's being written about this thing called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the US and the EU, that deal is almost exclusively going behind the border. It's not about cutting tariffs, and agriculture is not even on the agenda. By the way, none of these regional trade agreements address agriculture. They all avoid the 500-pound gorilla in the room of agriculture. They focus on behind the border. In fact, in this agreement, they're really interested in regulatory convergence. The Europeans want access to public contracting in the US. The US wants the Europeans to tidy up their labeling of genetically modified organisms. This is regulatory convergence, harmonizing of rules inside the border as opposed to rules at the border. The WTO is not well designed to deal with that problem. This poses a real challenge to the WTO, in my opinion, in that the growth in PTAs is completely outside of the purview of the WTO. Article 24 of the GATT allows discriminatory trading arrangements. So here's how a PFA works. Joyce and I join one, and we exclude Apple. We no longer have the most favoured nation clause. It's completely discriminatory. Bad luck. You're outside. You're not in the club. Okay? For idiosyncratic reasons, you in the EU, right? I'm the US. You want to get access to my public contracting, right? Foreigners are not allowed to supply into public contracts in the US. That's one reason how we managed to keep the US, I'm speaking as a US citizen here, we kept Airbus out of supplying early warning aircraft because Boeing bitched in Congress and got the contract overturned. I'm not joking. And so the GATT actually, in a sense, has put in place in its own law a reason for why it might disappear, which is it put in a clause that said you're allowed to have discrimination if you form a bilateral trading arrangement as long as you lower most of the tariffs between yourselves. And that explosion of regional trade agreements I don't think was ever expected by the founding fathers of the GATT. I don't think they ever believed we would see that many regional trading agreements, and that was because, why do you think they put that clause in? Think of history. Why did they put that clause in? What was that clause put in for? We didn't want the French and the Germans fighting each other again in Europe. The European Union was originally conceived as a way of tying them together economically so there would never be another European war. They're signatories of the GATT, so you have to give them a let-out clause to form the European Economic Community. The belief was you'd never see that many being organised. Everybody would realise the benefits of multilateral trade liberalisation, but now you've seen this explosion, and I don't think that was ever conceived of by the founding fathers of the GATT. So you remember I talked about concession erosion. The fear of concession erosion has now been replaced by fear of preference erosion. Joyce and I form a bilateral cut tariffs amongst ourselves to preferential trading arrangement. We don't want to allow Abdul into the party. Yep. Whereas before we negotiated with a view to letting him in because we didn't want to erode our concessions. Now we don't want to erode, you have preferential access to my market and I'm to yours, you don't. Okay? And this is becoming a stumbling block, I think, for further most favoured nation status agreements. And Limau has been publishing a lot on this, mostly in RE Stud and the AER, showing that NAFTA is now forming a stumbling block to the US considering more multilateral trade liberalization, and it's, you know, you can add on all the other free trade agreements that countries have joined. Now Richard Baldwin, who's an economist working in Geneva, if you go back to Bhagwati gets really worried about all these regional trade agreements, and there's thousands of them. And I think if every member of the WTO formed a bilateral, every other member, there'd be 11,500 free trade agreements. And he's famous for calling this the spaghetti bowls. And in Asia, it's called the noodle bowl syndrome. And but Baldwin argues this actually might have been a little bit exaggerated, this idea of the spaghetti bowl effect. So let's think about Europe. So European Union started writing a lot of bilaterals with North African countries and East European countries in the early 1990s. So remember, we're trying to lock in East European countries. They've thrown off Soviet-style communism. They're freeing up their markets. We want them to have free market capitalism, sort of the Washington Consensus, if you like. So in order to tie them in some sense, we formed a lot of free trade agreements with the EU. I'm now talking as a European, not an American citizen. Okay? Now, it resulted in a lot of very complicated rules of origin. So the way I would explain rules of origin is, let's suppose Mexico makes cokes. I believe they make cokes. Okay. And they can come into the US tariff-free, unless that coke was made substantially with materials imported from outside of NAFTA. That's the rule of origin. Once you can prove that that coke contains inputs from a country outside of NAFTA, you can slap a tariff on at the border, and they accumulate depending on how much input is imported. So you have all these agreements, that's spaghetti bowl, right? Different countries design different rules of origin depending on the agreement they signed with a bilateral partner. So what happens is, it's very inefficient. Inputs run around the EU in the early 1990s seeking the lowest tariff so that it can be traded. Suddenly in Europe, in the mid-90s, they start figuring out, hey, we want to offshore. We want to offshore not to, a British company doesn't want to offshore to France, it wants to offshore to Poland, which is not yet a member of the EU, but has a bilateral signed with the EU. So what do firms start lobbying Brussels to do? We have these really complicated rules of origin. We don't care where we get our inputs from. We just want to get them as cheap as possible. Can you please get rid of all these complex bilateral arrangements that you've made with all these different rules of origin? So under political pressure, what the Europeans did by the late 1990s, they formed an agreement. It's called the Pan-European Accumulation System, whereby they basically harmonized all the rules about trade and inputs because of offshoring. By offshoring, I mean I'm talking about offshoring that would involve European firms going outside of the EU or going to China or wherever. And so essentially what the Europeans did is they simplified the rules of origin. Regionalism, right, it basically became multilateralism, the input trade within Europe. And Baldwin talks about regional trading agreements being a way of knocking down these stumbling blocks to multilateralism. The problem is, though, is that the WTO was a complete bystander in all of this. It had nothing to do with it whatsoever. It didn't write the agreement, it didn't push the agreement, it doesn't monitor the agreement. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that countries that are not party to this European agreement have had their export interests hurt because they're outside of the club. We haven't resolved the basic problem that regionalism generates, which is discrimination against non-members of the club. So, that's my last slide. I'm going to answer my own question. So in the post-war period, this reciprocal exchange of market access has driven significant reduction in manufacturing tariffs, and it's increased trade predominantly amongst the developed countries. The exceptions being China, India, now Vietnam, and other developing countries that did choose to free up their international trade. But the WTO, despite being in place now for what? 20 years, 1994, the Uruguay Round Agreement was signed in Marrakesh. We have not delivered any form of new agreement that cuts tariffs and really brings developing countries in particular into the fold. All we've done is simplify customs rules, which everybody could agree on. By customs rule, I'm talking about paperwork. The Europeans did this back in the 1990s under the so-called Single European Act. Now I'm going to argue, and you might think this is, maybe I'm just trying to be controversial for the sake of it, but I listened to Luther talk enough times to know that you've got to push the boundaries a little bit sometimes. I don't think it's about bringing developing countries to the table. I think we can do that. To bring developing countries to the table, developed countries have to buy off their farm sector in order to remove farm subsidies and give developing countries some reason to lower their own tariffs. What you give is what you get. I'm turning this around by saying, yes, developing countries didn't get much in the previous 9 rounds, but they're willing, if they're willing to come to the table with tariff cuts now, the US, Europe, Japan, and the other subsidizers have to be willing to come to the table to get rid of, well, not get rid of farm subsidies, but significantly reform those farm subsidies in a way that they don't distort world prices. Okay? Now, I haven't talked about the side issues of environmental standards. I think they're a side issue. They're not the reason we can't reach an agreement in the WTO. It's this desire for deep integration that matters. This dealing with behind-the-border policies that the WTO is not designed to deal with, I think is why the WTO in some sense is becoming not irrelevant, but becoming less relevant in terms of trade liberalization. I mean, just think about that growth in regional trade agreements. Since 1990, we've had how many global trade agreements? 1, which took from 1987 to 1994, and we haven't had one since. But there's been a spectacular increase in the number of bilaterals since then, since the early 1990s. I think this is being driven by a desire for deep integration. If you go to Europe, that's what the debate is between the Brits and everybody else in the EU. And maybe I'm simplifying here, but the Brits, my country people, do not want deep integration. And what it entails. What does it entail? It entails giving up sovereignty over regulation and rules and culture and other issues. And crudely, we don't want Brussels telling us what to do. We want to keep the pound note with the Queen's head on it. Right now, we probably made a smart choice not being in the euro. As my bank account would tell you. But the Germans and the French and others in Europe want deeper integration. This is about these behind-the-border measures. Right? Regulatory convergence. You don't need cars with the driving wheel on the right-hand side, guys. Why can't you drive on the correct side of the road from a French or a German standpoint, right? That's regulatory. These are behind-the-border barriers to trade. That's why you've seen this growth in PTAs. The debate in Europe is about how deep do we go. They've got way beyond shallow integration to deep, deep integration, be it political, economic, or social. But I think that's why the US is pushing so hard. They figured out nothing's going to happen in the WTO on agriculture, partly because of themselves, partly because of India and others, and Brazil holding things up on their side. Maybe for good reason. Right? how do we get the Europeans to get rid of their labelling on GMOs? All these harmonised rules on how you're not going to do it through the WTO. The WTO wouldn't even rule on labelling for GMOs. And so, I didn't think I was going to end with this bullet, but I decided I would. The WTO is still relevant. It's relevant because of dispute settlement. If we got anything out of the signing of the WTO agreement in Marrakesh, it was we now have a dispute settlement mechanism that I think does a pretty good job. We can debate who should be at the disputes. Should Greenpeace be there? Should we just allow lawyers? Should we have more economists like myself making big bucks as acting as special witnesses, expert witnesses, and so on? Most things don't go to dispute. You have a dispute, but they get resolved way before they go before the lawyers. Why? Because the threat of retaliation is credible. That mechanism has worked. Have we seen a trade war since the 1940s? A global trade war? No. Many clashes around the world, but not a global trade war. But the WTO is on the sidelines, as far as I can tell right now, because countries are pursuing trade liberalization via regionalism, not multilateralism, largely driven, in my view. The reason for bilaterals is not just offshoring, obviously, but I think the real growth in bilaterals since the 1990s was driven by Factory Asia. Factory Asia is this huge outsourcing, offshoring, inability to write complete contracts, is leading to bilateral bargains, which the WTO can't deal with. I've spoken for way too long, but lots of questions were asked along the way. So I never said anything about the environment, but so be it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. We have time for...
And thanks to Joyce and Abdul for being... Joyce.